Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SMU and historic McFarland Auditorium. My name is Brad Cheeves, and I'm privileged to serve as Vice President for Development and External Affairs, and it is indeed a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the university to tonight's Jackson Lecture featuring New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. It is an honor for the university to pair with its oldest school to bring Reverend Wright to the campus, and we're looking forward to hearing from him. We have several special guests with us this evening, and as I introduce them, I would ask that they stand in the audience. If you would please hold your applause until these folks have all been introduced. So to begin, from the SMU community, member of the SMU Board of Trustees, our governing board, and Bishop of the North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, Mike McKee, and SMU Provost Vice President for Academic Affairs, Steve Corral, and his wife, Cheyenne. Would you please stand so that we might welcome you this evening? We would like to acknowledge those sponsors in attendance who joined with Perkins to make Reverend Dr. Wright's visit to SMU possible. They are the Church of the Incarnation, alumna June Dales, the Episcopal Diocese of Dallas, Highland Park Presbyterian Church, whose contribution made tonight's lecture in McFarland Auditorium as well as tonight's live stream possible, Highland Park United Methodist Church, Mr. and Mrs. Philip Lack, North Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, SMU Office of the Chaplain and Religious Life, led by University Chaplain Reverend Dr. Steve Rankin, and St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal Church. Would representatives from those churches and organizations please stand so that we might express our appreciation to you? Please stand. I would remind everybody that that all cell phones should be turned off. There should be no video recording or photography this evening, and no live streaming of any kind. It is important that you should know, though, that these lectures will be made available online at smu.edu/Perkins. Reverend Dr. Wright's visit to SMU was coordinated by the Perkins School Office of External Programs, led by Reverend Dr. Priscilla Pope Levison. Priscilla and her staff worked tirelessly for months to make sure that tonight's event, and as well as those tomorrow and Thursday, are a success. And please join me in thanking Priscilla, her team, for their hard work. Priscilla, would you please stand so that we might thank you? Thank you very much. Following his remarks this evening, Reverend Dr. Wright will take audience questions. We will be taking questions this session via Twitter. So using the hashtag #SimplyPerkins, that's Simply Perkins, that's clever, isn't it? By emailing, or you may also email popelevison@smu.edu. So you email or Twitter Simply Perkins. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Perkins School of Theology, Craig Hill. Dean Hill joined Perkins this summer after serving as the Executive Director of the Doctor of Ministry and Master of Christian Practice programs at Duke Divinity School. A New Testament scholar himself, Dean Hill and Tom Wright have crossed paths many times and are great respecters of each other's work. Please join me in welcoming one of the newest citizens here at SMU, our own Dean Craig Hill.
Thank you. Thank you. They never make these things tall enough, but thanks. On behalf of Perkins School of Theology, it's my great privilege to welcome all of you to this evening's presentation. I'd also like to invite you to explore other ways you might connect with Perkins, such as enrolling in a single class or indeed an entire degree program. You'll find our website address and phone number in your program and additional information on the table in the lobby. Many of you, I'm sure, are well aware of N.T., henceforth Tom Wright's long and quite extraordinary list of achievements. If not, you'll find them summarized in the program that you received upon entering the hall. I'd like to offer a more personal word of introduction. I first met Tom 30 years ago when I was a doctoral student in New Testament at the University of Oxford. It was an incredible place and time, one that shaped me deeply. There I had regular access to an amazingly gifted and remarkably diverse group of scholars. My academic supervisor was E.P. Sanders. In my college, Christ Church, were among others Morris Wiles, Oliver O'Donovan, and Rowan Williams. And just a few blocks away at Worcester College was Tom Wright. I spent a year during my master's degree in Oxford, and it was what impressed me then about the place that drew me back years later, and that has been a paradigm for me ever since. It was Oxford's intellectual balance, fairness, and civility, as well as its rigor, that drew me in. As you'll find in the lectures that Perkins sponsors, a considerable range of views was present, but also at Oxford, with occasional exception, as Tom knows, a sense of collegiality and mutual esteem. Surprisingly, we graduate students were fully welcomed into that collegium and made to feel that we too had something to contribute. For example, I was part of the same New Testament seminar in which the Oxford faculty, including Tom Wright and Ed Sanders, always participated, as did a marvelous stream of visiting scholars, everyone from Raymond Brown to Martin Hengel, from C.F.D. Moule to Geza Vermesh. That's a model for me here at Perkins. The Christian intellectual tradition is wonderfully deep and wide, and we strive to be one of those rare places where diverse views come into respectful and mutually corrective contact. It's the sort of constructive dialogue that I've seen Tom Wright engage in week after week, year after year. There's a second behavior that Tom himself and this lecture series both model: engagement with the church. Tom is one of very few outstanding scholars who has invested as much, perhaps more energy in serving the church than in serving the academy. When I first knew him, he was a college chaplain as well as a New Testament scholar. He eventually went on to become a bishop in the Church of England and to hold a number of traditional academic posts. I can think of no one of his stature who has written more. Actually, I could stop the sentence right there. I can think of no one of his stature who has written more for lay readers and for clergy than has Tom Wright. I honor Tom's concern for the church, and I wish more scholars followed his example. It's a commitment that we at Perkins also embrace. So it is a personal as well as a professional pleasure for me to welcome our speaker this evening, Bishop as well as Professor N.T. Wright.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your welcome. Thank you, Craig, for your kind words. And I add my thanks to those already mentioned, to Priscilla Pope-Leveson, who has worked tirelessly to organize this whole event. And as I have discovered over the last year, since she and I and her husband Jack sat down to plan what we were going to do, when Priscilla organizes something, it stays organized. And that's wonderful. Thank you. It's great to be back at SMU. It's quite a while since I've been here, and to enjoy the warmth of Texas just as we in Scotland are sinking into our dark and chilly winter. And it's also nice to come to somewhere where you're not having any particular political turmoils and so on at the moment. We've had ours, but I hear there are odd things going on. We British always enjoy speaking in the USA, perhaps especially the South, for linguistic reasons. A former colleague of mine, John Bowker, sometime of Cambridge, was once invited to address a conference in America, and he was very busy, and he didn't even recall the type of conference it was, but just knew he was supposed to be lecturing about God, as you do. And he arrived at the last moment and gave his address, ending by declaring triumphantly that if the doctrine of the Trinity didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent it. And he received a wonderful ovation and sat down to prolonged applause. And as he sat down, his neighbor on the platform said, "Very daring, very daring." And he said, "Well, I thought it was really very orthodox. Well, yes, said the speaker, but this is a Unitarian conference. So said Bowker, why are they all applauding? Oh, he said, they just love your accent. So I hope the accent at least will carry me through this evening. It's going to have to, because my body clock is telling me it's nearly 2 a.m, so bear with me. But though I hope what I'm going to say is basically orthodox, the whole point, as in my title, The Jesus We Never Knew, is that we, and by we I mean all of us, scholar and non-scholar, Christian and non-Christian, all of us in today's Western world, when we think about Jesus, the reality is so powerful and challenging that we easily scale it down to something we can fit into the way our minds already work. We remake Jesus, if not in our own image, though that happens too sometimes, then into something or someone we can cope with a bit more easily. As you know, one of the great events of this last week, a sad event, is that the great singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen just died. I recall from the 60s the Jesus image in his song Suzanne. And Jesus was a sailor when he walked upon the water, and he spent a long time watching from his lonely wooden tower. And when he knew for certain only drowning men could see him, he said, all men will be sailors then, until the sea shall free them. But he himself was broken long before the sky could open. Forsaken, almost human, he sank beneath your wisdom like a stone. And you want to travel with him, and you want to travel blind, and you think maybe you'll trust him, for he's touched your perfect body with his mind. I wish my voice was half an octave deeper and then I could sing it the way that Cohen did, but still. I was a teenager in the 60s, and I still remember the almost electric shock of words like that. No one had done that before. Cohen invited us, as poets do, to look at reality, at Jesus even, from new and disturbing angles. He sank beneath your wisdom like a stone. Generations have heaped up words about Jesus, and the real Jesus is mostly obscured by them rather than illuminated. And the way Cohen turns around the story of Jesus walking on the water catches at today's easygoing Jesus images as well as scholarly constructs. When he knew for certain only drowning men could see him. Perhaps it is only when we individually or collectively are driven away from comfort, when we feel ourselves drowning for whatever reason, that we are ready, humble enough perhaps, to come back to Jesus and reach out a hand to him like a drowning child grabbing for a parent's outstretched hand. Now, rationalists would, of course, sneer at this. That, they would say, is the way to be sure you get a Jesus who offers you the help you think you want. But whoever supposed that only cool, detached rationalism could give you true answers to life's most important questions? Reason is like the engine of the car. You need it, but it needs fuel to drive it and a human will to direct it. And if you're drowning, actually, reaching out for help is the most reasonable thing you can do. Among the multiple ironies of Cohen's poem is that line, forsaken, almost human. Cohen seems to start by thinking of Jesus as a divine being, some kind of Superman floating around, coming down towards earth, who then, we realize, as he comes to a sad end, he is almost human. Now, that's the exact opposite of what most people in our culture have imagined, which is a straightforwardly human Jesus who from time to time gives us hints of something more. And that humanist Jesus picture has then bred other reactions. Many people have said that the something more, the divine bit, if you like, was added to the stories by the next generation to boost the legend, to keep the dream alive, and so on. But at least it puts the question on the table and gets us wondering and thinking. when we get beyond our inherited and imagined stereotypes, what can we truly say about the Jesus we never knew? And in the light of that, what can we say about God? Asking those questions sends me back in my mind about 15 years ago. My wife and I were invited to lead a private pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The couple who invited us were a very interesting and remarkable couple. The wife was, in a quiet way, a practicing Christian, but the husband, Sir Stanley Clarke, was a leading industrialist and philanthropist who had always held back from any specific faith. And now he was, by then in his late 60s, he clearly wanted to sort things out for himself. As my wife said to me afterwards, this is how Stan's run his life. He decides what question he wants to ask. He goes and finds a tame expert. He looks them in the eye and he asks them the question. On the first evening of the trip, after a long and tiring journey, we were finally settled into our hotel in Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee. And at the end of dinner, as they were serving coffee, Stan took a deep breath and looked at me. So, Tom, he said, let's get this straight. There really was a Jesus Christ. Yes, Stan, I said, there really was a Jesus Christ. And he really did die on a cross. I said, yes, he really did die on a cross. And he really did rise from the dead? Yes, I replied, and when we get to that point, I'll be explaining how we can be sure of that. And then he gave me a long, hard look. Stan had succeeded in business by giving people long, hard looks and then asking the crunch questions. So he said, who is God anyway? I managed to keep my nerve and restrain my academic's impulse from launching into a half-hour lecture on the Trinity. And I just said, more or less, great question. We're going to be thinking about that throughout the next 2 weeks. And we did. And a year or two afterwards, something happened which fascinated me. The trip had a profound impact on Stan. Within months, he made a public profession of faith, and he then soon afterwards entered a 3-year battle with cancer, which would finally kill him. But during that process, I watched Stan coming to terms with the Jesus he had encountered in the Holy Land, the Jesus he had never known. To begin with, he encountered Jesus as a living person, someone to get to know, someone to follow obediently. But at the start, whenever we talked, as I naturally would, about Jesus and the kingdom of God and the implications of the kingdom of God for today's world, Stan would always want to hold back. A spiritual Jesus was fine. That was meeting his own needs where he was. But a social and politically involved Jesus, nope, we're not going there. Stan was on the right of British politics, which, as you may know, is probably centre-left in yours, but that's a whole other story. And in Britain, the right tend not to like Christians talking about political issues in case it upsets the status quo of business and finance. You can figure that out. And so Stan didn't really want me to talk about the kingdom of, but in his last year, without me doing anything more, he changed. And the last time we met, I was talking and praying with him and his wife when they knew they didn't have much time left together. But he had something he wanted to say to me particularly. Tom, he said, you must go on telling people about what Jesus wants in the world, about justice and peace and helping the poor. It's important people hear that. You might have thought that a man facing death would be thinking about life after death, and he was. But what he'd learnt about Jesus in the 3 years that he had been an explicit and open disciple was a bigger vision altogether, a vision of the Jesus who had launched God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. The Jesus we never knew. The Jesus Western culture has done its best to ignore or forget. The Jesus who still stands at the crossroads of history and beckons. Modern Western culture has, of course, been haunted by Jesus, sometimes almost obsessed by him. One sure way of getting on the front cover of Time magazine has been to write something new and edgy about Jesus. 20 years ago, this was all the rage with a group calling itself the Jesus Seminar, who made a splash in America, though actually nowhere much else, with their claims to have concluded on scientific historical grounds that Jesus never did and said most of what the Bible says he did and said, that he didn't claim to be the Son of God, he never thought he was going to die for the sins of the world, and he certainly didn't rise from the dead. Now, a few maverick writers have gone even further and claimed that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, that the whole thing was made up a generation or two later by a new religious group who just wanted to validate their own existence. And over against that, there are many images in popular culture, mine as well as yours, in which Jesus plays the role of Superman, swooping in with supernatural power to do crazy things called miracles, to overcome evil, and then to go back to heaven taking people with him, or promising to do so if they will say a simple prayer and try to stop misbehaving. I think Leonard Cohen would have made short work of both those extremes, and he'd have been right. His own solution, though, if it really was that, since it was after all a poem, not a work of theology, is itself only a distant pointer to the larger, stranger reality that our culture, both our Christian culture and our atheist culture, has done its best to ignore. Because, like it or not, Jesus doesn't fit. He doesn't fit into our culture. We don't have a ready-made box where he can be safely placed. And indeed, the idea of placing Jesus in a box is already ridiculous. They tried that once and it didn't work. We have boxes, though, called religious guru or spiritual hero or social revolutionary. And if we are Christians, we probably have categories like divinity and humanity, which we think we know what they are, and we think they're absolutes, which can then be predicated or not of Jesus. And we tell ourselves stories from our culture about sin and salvation, about sin and holiness, about sin and guilt and hell. Sin tends to come into most of them for various reasons. And we assume that however we tell those sorry stories, Jesus, whoever he is, will just fit into those stories and provide the solution. And the Jesus we never knew stands there patiently, waiting, ready to tell us, as he so often did, a story which isn't quite the story we were expecting or wanting, a story to break open our questions and come at the whole thing from a different angle. Once upon a time, there was a man who had 2 sons, or a farmer sowing seed, or a woman who lost a coin, or whatever it might be. Fortunately, this can and does still happen. Jesus has an uncanny knack of coming and telling stories that weren't what we wanted or thought. And when that happens, it's life transforming. But how does it happen? And how can it happen to me, to you, to us, to our culture, to our world? There are 2 basic ways in which we get to know and know about Jesus. And part of our problem in the Western church and world is that these 2 ways have been held firmly apart, as though they've got nothing to do with one another. And that is one of the reasons that the real Jesus so often escapes and slips between the cracks of our fumbling grasp. We've given these 2 ways of listening for the real Jesus the deceptively simple-sounding names of history and faith. Again, as though we assume we know what those 2 words mean, and we assume often in our culture that history and faith are like oil and water. They won't mix, and it gets very messy if you try. And that mistake too, and it is a mistake, is part of our modern Western culture. It's specific to us. We owe it to the 18th century in particular, to the same cultural impulses that led Thomas Jefferson and others to hold church and state, faith and history if you like, firmly apart. I understand the plus side of doing that. Believe me, I have lived with the muddles of the British Constitution and a church which is established but nobody knows what that means, and so on and so forth. All our usual British compromises. I've lived with that all my life. But it was that same impulse at the same time which led skeptics to challenge Christian faith at the root by saying, we will study the history of the first century and we will prove that Jesus was really just a failed Jewish revolutionary, or perhaps just a spiritual teacher of timeless truths, or whatever, and that orthodox, heavy-handed, controlling Christianity was, after all, based on a historical mistake. And since that's what many people wanted to think in the 18th century for all sorts of other reasons as well, and since so many people in our culture want to reach the same conclusions today, it's not surprising that would-be historical research on Jesus has continued to suggest this negative result. We'll do the history and we'll pull down your grandiose Christian claims and show that however nice a guy Jesus may have been, however many good ideas he had, he certainly wasn't what you Christians have always said. And so history goes off in one direction, while then faith does a vertical takeoff in another direction. And would-be defenders of Christianity have often reacted by steering attention away from the messy historical questions and encouraging people into a world of a non-historical faith, of worship, of prayer, of personal spirituality. And those of us who have lived uncomfortably at the intersection of those two worlds have often found it, well, uncomfortable. As secular historians accuse us of smuggling faith into our historical study, and the advocates of a spiritual faith accuse us of submitting eternal truths to historical scrutiny, and so on. But I and others have persisted in this double quest despite all the naysayers. And we've done so because, in my case at least, I can't speak for the others, the more I study first century history, which by the way was part of my undergraduate degree, with Jesus at the middle of it, the more I find the figure of Jesus to be both real and disturbing and utterly compelling, though in several ways quite different from the Jesus I thought I knew about before when I was growing up. And the more I pray, the more I seek to follow Jesus in my own life, the more I attend the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine in his name, I find that I'm not just evoking a memory, but encountering a living and loving, though again a disturbing, presence. I find, in other words, that the very meaning of the words history and faith themselves get reconfigured around the figure of Jesus. There is no neutral territory. There is no epistemological Switzerland. There is no fixed ground from which to survey the options. The roads called history and faith are full of potholes and even sinkholes, and many regard them as too dangerous for serious travel. That, of course, is the point that postmodernity has made so graphically. But what postmodernity has not usually allowed for is that at the end of these damaged highways, there might be a different sort of reality, that this reality might be personal, and that this person might be beckoning us to step out of the boat, to walk on the water, to find him as the fully human being, in whom, to the horror of all our categories, the living Creator God was and is personally present. How on earth could we make a start on such a journey? There is a problem about simply starting with faith because our culture is always ready with the smart put-down, which shows that your faith or my faith is merely subjective. It has no actual purchase on reality. It emerges from your genes or your hang-ups or your Catholic upbringing or your fundamentalist forebears or your love of music or some quirk in your DNA or whatever, but it's not real. It doesn't tell you about the real world. We have separated off belief from reality and have then watched belief collapse into feeling and we've watched feelings themselves be deconstructed by Marx or Freud or Nietzsche or whoever, until all we're left with is prejudice, articulated either by the brute force of the victor or by the scream of the victim. That's not a good way to be, which is why faith itself needs to be reconstructed and reconnected with reason. But as we await that possibility, history remains a good place to begin. We know quite a lot about the first century of the Common Era. We know quite a lot, not least, about what was going on in the Middle East. And that is where we meet Jesus of Nazareth. He is a recognizable and identifiable figure of first century real history. And that, I suggest, is where we have to begin. Now, the Middle East was just as turbulent and confused and dangerous in the first century as it is today. Perhaps that's inevitable, as geographical factors bring different cultures together in close proximity, like tectonic plates that are bound to rub up against one another and cause earthquakes in society and politics and culture, and yes, religion. In the ancient world, we need to say a word about this word religion because it's so confusing. In the ancient world, religion was something that bound everything together. It was the complex interweaving of the visible and the invisible forces in a city, a village, a home, a country. In our world, especially since the 18th century, religion holds things apart. Faith apart from public life, spirituality from politics, and so on. So the word is more or less useless for studying history, since in the modern Western world at least, it's come to mean more or less the opposite of what it meant back then. The only people in the first century who would have recognized our Western separation of the worlds of the divine and the human would be the philosophers known as Epicureans. And there is a strong Epicurean streak in today's Western culture, pushing the gods upstairs out of sight and allowing us to get on running the world the way we want to. Sounds familiar? It was your very own Thomas Jefferson who said, "I am an Epicurean." Let's just pause at that point and reflect. Ancient Epicureanism, interestingly, was a philosophy of the elite, who could themselves separate themselves off from the common herd and live in isolated luxury. And that's what they thought the gods did. That again sounds very much like today's Western world, though the dream was shattered on September the 11th, 2001, and is now in tatters with the refugee crisis, 1 million Lazaruses landing up at the rich man's gate. All this is important if we're to understand why it's hard for us Westerners, to grasp the meaning and message of Jesus. The Jewish people of Jesus' day were certainly not Epicureans, and indeed, to this day, the word Epicurean, coming through in Yiddish as apikoros or something like that, is one of the strongest Jewish terms of abuse. Basically, you're an unbeliever. You've got rid of the gods. You don't believe that God and our world have anything to do with each other. The Jewish people of Jesus' day had a very different worldview, and Jesus lived within that Jewish worldview and believed it was coming to fresh expression, fresh meaning, fresh and creative resolution in his own work. It's all too easy for us to glance at the Jesus of the Gospels and imagine that he meant what he meant within our worldview, but that is going to distort the whole picture. And here is the value of history. In the well-known cliche, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Genuine historical investigation is a continuous act of intellectual humility, putting our own way of seeing things on hold and allowing texts and artifacts from very different times and cultures to make their own impact and to suggest their own categories. And that's what we have to do with Jesus. I read a book recently by the late great British historian Asa Briggs. Asa Briggs was one of the bright young things in Cambridge during the Second World War and was recruited to be among those who worked at Bletchley Park, cracking the codes that told the German submarines what was going on. And they had access to these codes. They worked at cracking the codes. And he said, they recruited historians to do this task because historians were trained to think into the minds of people who thought very differently from how they did. And so they were good at thinking into the minds of German submarine commanders, whatever. So that's what we're doing with history. We're trying to get into a different world, not forcing that world to conform to our stereotypes. A word about sources, because I'll be sure that if I don't say this, somebody will want to ask the question anyway. Skeptics sometimes sneer that, well, the only real evidence for Jesus comes from your early Christian writings, the four Gospels in particular. And of course, they're biased because the authors all believed in Jesus anyway. Actually, things are more complicated and interesting than that. There are non-Christian sources which mention Jesus and his followers, like the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, the Jewish historian Josephus, the Roman statesman Pliny. They don't say very much about him. By the time they were writing, the movement had only just begun, and it was far off in a foreign country for all of them except Josephus. But then the letters of Paul, however, our earliest surviving Christian writings, show beyond any doubt that within 20 years of Jesus' death, there were people all around the Eastern Mediterranean world who were declaring public allegiance to this Jesus rather than to their local tribal or political leaders and divinities. And Paul knew that this only made sense because of the sheer historical reality of Jesus and his death, and Paul insisted his resurrection. So we've got good evidence for the existence of Jesus and already for quite a lot about him, about his emphasis on the kingdom of God and all that that meant. But what about the charges that the main sources are biased? Let's face it, all writers on all subjects are biased. There is no point of view which is nobody's point of view. So, of course, the gospel writers and Paul are biased in the sense that they have selected and arranged their material according to the things they want to tell their readers. Big deal. That's actually what everybody does. We all do it all the time. But that doesn't mean that you make up the basic story. All writers and speakers in public and private select and arrange. I am a lifelong supporter of a not very successful English football club, Newcastle United. It used to be successful, hasn't been for a long time. But if I read the report of a recent match in the newspapers from Newcastle, I expect to find them grieving over every loss, and there have been many, and celebrating wildly over every victory. And just recently we've started to have a few. But obviously, the local newspapers are heavily biased, but I don't expect them to tell me the wrong score. You know, that would make no sense at all. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, though of course wanting passionately to tell people that Jesus of Nazareth was and is the living embodiment of Israel's God, coming back at last to rescue Israel and the world, they are precisely wanting to say that these things happened. These are not ideas projected onto a fictitious screen. Actual events mattered to them precisely because they were Jews whose message was about stuff that happens in the real world and carries divine significance. The message was about God becoming king on earth as in heaven. Only makes sense if it's about stuff that more or less actually happened. Of course, there were other writers later on who told the story quite differently. There has again been a modern American fashion for suggesting that books like the so-called Gospel of Thomas were actually written earlier than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that the four who made it into the New Testament did so as a kind of political move some centuries later, because they were offering a toned down and more socially acceptable version of the truly radical early message of Jesus. This comes through in popular books like the Da Vinci Code and so on, but also in some more scholarly works. But it is unwarranted historically, and is in any case actually a rather obvious instance of one particular modern Western culture projecting its own desires back onto the first century. The other Gospels mostly come from circles we know as Gnostic, offering secret revelations for the elite insiders. Revelations precisely not about God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, but about a private spirituality now and an escapist heaven hereafter. And this has been the default mode of much Western religion for at least 2 centuries, but it has no purchase on first century historical reality. In fact, the Gnostics were the ones who escaped persecution. No empire is going to bother about people who cultivate a private spirituality and an escapist soteriology. Empires do take much more notice of people who go around saying that someone different is now the true Lord of the world. And that's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were saying and doing about Jesus, the Jesus we never knew. So what can be said about the real historical world and the real historical meaning of Jesus of Nazareth? Jesus was born into a world of hope, but the hope had been sorely tested. The hope was expressed in powerful symbols, which had themselves become a puzzle. And behind the hope and the symbols, though, is the great story. And this is perhaps the hardest thing for us in the modern Western world to get our heads and our hearts around. But without it, we won't understand the hope and the symbols, and we certainly then won't understand what Jesus meant when he announced that this at last was the time for God to become king, which was, after all, the central theme of his public proclamation. The story goes back many, many centuries before Jesus' day. However much history you know about your country or even mine, it won't be the same kind of story as the one Jesus and his contemporaries were telling, the one they believed they were living in. We in Britain tell the story of our island home. Many of you have visited it, kings and queens and battles and revolutions and so on. But we don't tell the story of our country as a story which is moving in a particular direction and has an obvious goal, whether or not we think we've got there. Or if we do it with a bit of a smile, since we're quite resigned to the fact that we had an empire a century or so ago and it's kind of dwindled into the Commonwealth, which is a nice club, but it doesn't cut much political ice or expect to do so. You, of course, for your part, like the French, tell the story of your nation in terms of the glorious revolution of the 18th century. Something happened which changed everything and which you must now live out. That's why you always hope that in the next election you will at last vote for the Messiah and then get puzzled when it doesn't happen. I had quite forgotten I'd written that in my notes. I apologize if that was... But you see, this is one of the central reasons why Jesus eludes our grasp. The 18th century Enlightenment taught all Westerners, Europeans as well as Americans, to suppose that up to that point, the world had been in a kind of superstitious semi-darkness, from which the developments in science, technology, and political theory had at last set us free. The human race had come of age. We gave up superstition on the one hand and dictatorships on the other. And we, or at least you, embraced the bright new world in which, Epicureanism again, the gods had been banished upstairs and we could run the downstairs world. Now, this is the movement that postmodernity has shown up as a self-serving confidence trick. Yes, science and technology have done amazing things. And yes, I prefer democracy to dictators. But this was not the climax of history. Contrast the hope of the Jewish people of Jesus' day. When we look at the 5 centuries before Jesus, we trace a very specific hope. They recalled in festival and song their ancient origins. They were children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They'd been promised a land as their inheritance. They were rescued from slavery in Egypt. They told these stories again and again and again. The little children knew them by heart. They'd been given the divine law, the Torah, to guide and guard them. They told and retold the stories of David and Solomon, the building of the temple, the time when the promises seemed to be fulfilled forever. But it had all gone horribly wrong. Subsequent kings had gone to the bad. Prophets had spoken lies. Priests had committed abomination. Most of the original 12 tribes were lost. And finally, Babylon had overcome the rest, had destroyed the temple, had taken the people into exile. And the prophets of the time interpreted this as the direct result of Israel's idolatry and sin. Israel was kicked out of the land like Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And that was the point. Worst of all was the belief that Israel's God, Yahweh, had left his people to their fate. They had abandoned him, so he had abandoned them. And that was what the original covenant had stipulated, and it had happened. But the same prophets assured the exiles that the ancient covenant also promised a time of return, of restoration, a time when Yahweh and Israel would get together again, like the reconciliation of a divorced couple. When that happened, said the prophets, then not only would Israel be restored, the temple rebuilt, not only would Yahweh return to live in the temple once more, then the nations of the world would come to see what had happened and would abandon their idols and worship the one true God at last. And this would be the fulfillment of the original plan for which God had called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the first place. This was the Creator's intention for the whole cosmos. And this would be the true climax of history. That's not just a vague idea. They lived it. They had festivals which celebrated it. They knew the stories. They knew the songs. This was their story. What was needed then was a new exodus. The original exodus from Egypt had been a rescue from slavery, but this second exodus, a release from this hideous exile, would be a release from a deeper slavery, which was the punishment for idolatry and sin. So it would be both rescue and forgiveness. So when some of the Jews did return from Babylon and did rebuild the temple, some thought this must be it, the new day had arrived. But it was a false dawn. The Jews were still not free. They were ruled over by the Persians, the Egyptians, the Syrians, and finally, after a brief, precarious independence, by the Romans. And throughout these later events, in century after century, you have to imagine, in a way that's very difficult for us as modern Westerners, people living with this entire story in their well-known folk memory. Throughout these later events, we find Jewish writings which cling onto and re-express the hope for the real return from exile, the real new Exodus, and particularly for Israel's God, Yahweh, to come back again as he had promised. The book of Daniel, one of the most popular prophecies of Jesus' day, promises that the exile would in fact last not for 70 years, but for 70 times 7 years, 490 years, nearly half a millennium. A jubilee of jubilees, and after that time, Israel's God would come back, rescue his people at last, and set up a new kingdom. That's the language Jesus took on. A new world through which all the ancient promises would be fulfilled. That was the hope of the Jews of Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, the prophesied half millennium was pretty well up. The oppression from Roman overlords and their local henchmen was getting worse. Every populist movement of the day, and there were many, was hailed by some as the agent of the long-awaited liberation. There were at least a dozen messianic or prophetic movements in the century either side of Jesus. People were on tiptoe with expectation, even though they weren't quite sure just what form that liberation would take, could take, should take. whether it would involve a great war, who would spearhead the movement. And all this is what I mean when I say that the hope of Israel was rooted in a long story in which Jesus and his contemporaries believed that they themselves were living. It wasn't just a story by itself way back then from which you could learn some abstract lessons. It was like the earlier acts of a drama in which suddenly you, called on stage, had to finish and take the story where it had to go. The story, they told themselves, wasn't just a parable, though you could tell parables about it, and Jesus did so. It wasn't just an illustration of spiritual truth, though there were profound theological truths embedded in it. The story was the real life story of God and Israel and the world, and each generation around the time of Jesus was hoping in whatever way that they would be the ones who would seize the moment and bring the story to its triumphant climax. And when Jesus appeared and said, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand," this must have been what people heard. This sense of a real living story, of actual history freighted with theological significance, is vital if we're to understand what Jesus thought he was doing and how his work was perceived. He wasn't then offering spiritual advice or ethical maxims or a fast track to heaven. He was announcing that the time had arrived for the hope of Israel to be fulfilled. This was the time for God to become king. Plenty of people in his day were longing for that news, but they didn't think it would look or sound like Jesus. He came to his own, and his own didn't receive him. The Jesus we never knew is the Jesus who came to fulfill this ancient hope, but to do so in a way nobody had seen coming. It takes, as I've said, considerable effort of the imagination to hold this thought in your mind and stop flicking back to the default modes of thinking about Jesus the guru, Jesus the one offering a quick route out of this world and into heaven. And if this is so about the story of Israel, the same is true for the other side of what I want to say, which is the symbol of Israel's national life, which was the temple in Jerusalem. For years, growing up as a young man, a young Christian, even when I was training for the ministry, I basically thought of the temple in Jerusalem as though it was just like a large cathedral, a big religious building to which people would go for special ceremonies to do that worship stuff. It was only when I lived in Jerusalem myself for 3 months and was staying at the Anglican cathedral up the road from the old city, where day by day we were saying the Psalms in our worship, that I realized what it actually meant, because it's there in the Psalms. You're actually saying that the creator of the universe has chosen, for reasons best known to himself, to take up permanent residence on this little hill just down the road. This is an incarnational symbol right there, and generations of biblical scholars and other readers have missed it. Jesus' action in the temple, when he went in and drove out the traders, and the way he explained that action bring into sharp focus the way he was telling and living the story of Israel, and the question of how he believed the kingdom of God was to be inaugurated on earth as in heaven. And to understand this, we have to make another trip back into Israel's scriptures. Again, we live in a largely Epicurean or at least deist world. God and all that is up there, and we live down here. And if there is any commerce between them, it's a bit odd and spooky and dodgy. That's not how people in the first century thought, apart from that very small number of elite philosophers. In the scriptures, the Creator made the world as a unified, though two-sided creation. Heaven and earth were made for one another. The creation story in Genesis 1 is modeled on the construction of a temple, a building where heaven and earth belong together. The wilderness tabernacle in Exodus was then a small working model of the whole creation, with Aaron the high priest taking the role of Adam and Eve in the original creation, the divine image bearers. And when Solomon constructed the first Jerusalem temple, it too was a microcosm, a small working model of the whole heaven and earth creation, with kings and priests as the image bearers. Most people never think of Israel's temple like that, and that's one reason we don't understand Jesus. The Jerusalem temple, you see, always was a sign of the divine intention to renew the whole creation. It stood at the heart of Israel's national life as a sign that Israel was the bearer of this promise for the whole world. But remember what had happened before. In the time of Jeremiah, the symbol had been turned outside in. The temple had been seen as a good luck charm, as a talisman, an automatic guarantee of security against foreign invaders, even if the people of Israel were taking no notice of it in the way that they should have done. The result was destruction and exile. And for Jesus too, the chief priests who ran the system were worldly and wealthy. And equally, many would-be revolutionaries bent on military violence against Rome regarded the temple as their ideological focus for that nationalist violence. And though the Temple Mount still retained the sense of divine promise and presence, like the Western Wall in Jerusalem still does to this day for millions of Jews, there was an equally strong sense that the great promises had not been fulfilled. The prophets went on promising that Yahweh would return to his temple, but he hadn't done so yet. Isaiah had said, centuries before, that Israel's God would return in plain sight and that the whole world would see it. Nowhere in that extended exile does anybody say it's happened. This is where the Jesus we never knew comes into sudden focus, as unexpected then as now. We are quite used to Jesus, the ethical teacher, Jesus saving souls for heaven, Jesus perhaps as a social revolutionary, or, as I said from the other side, Jesus as the Superman figure doing impossible things to prove that he's God. We may not agree with any or all of these pictures, but at least they're familiar. And even Leonard Cohen's disturbing image of Jesus, the drowning sailor, is a poetic image that we can understand and relate to. But Jesus as the living embodiment of Israel's returning, rescuing God, Jesus bringing to its climax not only Israel's history, but world history, this is not what we're used to. And it's not what Jesus' own contemporaries were expecting. Actually, this unexpectedness provides, incidentally, one of the clearest signs that this story was not being invented by clever writers a generation or so later. On the contrary, Jesus' own closest followers seem to have taken some while to get their heads around it, around what was happening and what it all meant. They didn't have a template all prepared into which Jesus could just step. Rather, Jesus burst open the existing templates and seemed to be insisting that what he was doing was the new focal point around which previous ideas had to be reorganized. The kingdom of God, he was saying, is like this and this and this, with each this indicating another extraordinary thing, the healing of a crippled woman, the raising of a dead girl, the shameless party with the down and outs and the riffraff, the extraordinary catch of fish, all accompanied by small, glittering stories which broke open the existing models of what it might look like when God came back to become king and created a fresh, imaginative world into which his hearers were invited to come if they dared. Yes, a world where a shamed father welcomes home his scapegrace son. A world where it's the Samaritan who shows what neighbor love would look like. A world in which the seeds of the final harvest will bear a great crop, but only when 3/4 of them seem to have failed. A world in which the farmer will come looking for fruit and won't find any, in which the vineyard owner will send his son to get the fruit and the tenants will kill him. A world in which God will become king, but not the way anyone had imagined. A world in which the full revelation of divine glory will not be in a blaze of light and fire coming to dwell in the existing temple, but rather in a life and death of utter self-giving love, which for those with eyes to see would reflect the self-giving love of creation itself. One of the reasons why skeptical historians have so often declared that the Gospels must have been made up later is that the skeptics, like many of the devout, have missed the central point. The story makes sense only but precisely in the first half of the 1st century AD, and only but precisely in the Palestine where the dominant story was the return from exile, the real second Exodus, and the dominant symbol was the Jerusalem temple as the microcosmos, the little world, the sign of hope for all creation, the place to which the living God had promised to return in glory. The sign, the symbol, and the promise that heaven and earth really did belong together and one day would come together completely. So when Jesus did extraordinary things, not least powerful healings, these were not 18th century style miracles. That's the problem with the word miracles, that we inherit this view of a distant or absent God who might occasionally reach in and do something odd and then quickly go away again. If that's what you mean by miracles, the New Testament doesn't support it. The miracles, the mighty deeds of Jesus, are deeds performed at the intersection of heaven and heaven and earth were always sort of intersecting. That's what temple theology is all about. They are signs that heaven and earth are coming together, that new creation is being launched. And when Jesus came to Jerusalem finally at Passover time, at Exodus time, and when he declared in powerful symbol and word that he was effectively upstaging the temple, that the sun was rising and it was time to give up the flickering candles of earlier symbols, he was announcing that this was how the living God was becoming king on earth as in heaven. Jesus wasn't denouncing ordinary religion and telling us we had to go to heaven instead. He wasn't offering simply a new private spirituality or ethic, though prayer and transformed human living follow right on from what he was actually doing. Jesus was unidentified by his contemporaries because he didn't fit their expectations of a Messiah or of God's coming kingdom. And he is unrecognized or cut down to size, harmless size, in the modern Western world, because we think world history reached its climax in the 18th century rather than the first, and because of our split-level Epicurean world where religion and Jesus with it belong up there with the irrelevant gods rather than downstairs disturbing and remaking the world around himself. That's why it's been so difficult for modern Westerners to understand the real Jesus, because he lived within that world of story and symbol, the new Exodus, the new temple, which we have pushed to one side in our efforts to make him fit our models, to speak to different questions, different construals of the human plight. But once we get inside the history, then the Jesus we never knew shines through. And now at last is the point at which history poses the big question to faith. The question of faith, will you now believe in this God? And the question to faith, supposing you already say you believe in God, will you allow your vision of God to be reordered around this point? This always was and is the question posed by the Gospels, by the early Christians as they went out into the world with their unexpected and unwanted message. Whatever the word God has meant before, they were saying, think of it being reshaped around Jesus. That's the challenge. You can't do it the other way around. You can't first sort out what you want to mean by God and then squeeze Jesus into that. That's what we've often tried to do, and it doesn't work. The first Christians insisted you had to do it the other way around. Look long and hard and humbly and in awe at Jesus himself and try to think what the word God might mean if this is what it looked like when the world's creator, Israel's God, came back in glory to do what he'd always promised. I'll be speaking more about this tomorrow night, and our time now is short, but let me just push the point home by saying this. In Western culture, people have routinely imagined that the word God is univocal, that it always means the same. It doesn't and never has. There are various options. If you ask someone in the street here in Dallas, or for that matter in London, if they believe in God, chances are they will think of the distant God of modern Westerning imagining, the deist God or Epicurean, distant, aloof, detached, uncaring, though still perhaps threatening. What a bad combination. In reaction to that, now as in the ancient world, some flirt with pantheism, that there's a divine force in everything, and we're all part of it. But that too has little in common with the temple-focused and story-shaped world of Jesus. Many Christians think in Platonic terms of a shabby, downstairs, messy world of physicality and bodies and sex and politics and all that nasty stuff from which we're going to escape up into a detached heaven. No wonder we never really knew Jesus. Even though in grace and mercy, Jesus makes himself known, despite our wrong ideas and mistaken imaginings. But when you start with the story of the long-awaited return from exile, which is also the forgiveness of sins, when you start with the unfinished narrative of Yahweh and his dealings with his people, when you hold in your minds the promise that when all other help fails, then Israel's God will come in person to rescue and deliver, and when you start with the symbol of the temple in which heaven and earth belong together as the sign of creation and new creation, with a human being, a king, a priest, standing there to complete the picture, then it makes sense, glorious sense, world-shattering sense, heaven and earth sense, to see Jesus of Nazareth as the climax of this story, the fulfillment of this symbol, the embodiment of this God. And the four Gospels, which tell his rich, powerful story, are written as an invitation. Here they are saying, is the story of the world's true God. You didn't know him, but he knew you. You didn't want him, truth be told, because he comes to wound as well as heal, to warn as well as to welcome. But the four Gospels tell their story, and they invite you to read it and make it your own, to read it prayerfully, humbly, wonderingly, asking that your own life will be reoriented around this life, this divine life, this human life. Jesus reaches out his hand as to a drowning child, and we who feel ourselves sinking under the wisdom of the world will find that in his brokenness he will touch our brokenness, that in his forsakenness he will meet us in ours. About that I shall say much more, God willing, tomorrow night. But for now, hold on to the story and the symbol, and see them both reaching their fulfillment in Jesus. And ask yourself, if you dare, what it would look like if the Jesus we never knew turned out to be the Jesus who knew us all along, the Jesus who came to launch God's rescuing rule on earth as in heaven, the Jesus who now loves us and calls us to follow him. Thank you.
Dr. Wright, of course, has agreed to answer a few questions, and there are many, far more than we have time but thank you very much for beginning this journey with us for the next few days with tonight's lecture. In terms of, there are many questions, but and I'm just going to go at random here as I've tried to sort them out, but just to begin, isn't it more important to live by Jesus' two great commandments? Love God and love neighbor, and not get too concerned with reconstructing the specific context of the first century world.
In a sense, yes. And it's rather like saying, if you're in a family, isn't it more important to make sure that the kids have some food on the table than it is to fix that problem with the drains or the leaking roof or whatever? Yeah, let's just get the kids fed. But actually, the whole family is going to be happier if you fix that drain before it gets toxic, and if you mend the roof before the next hurricane. And when the church does its work of theology and of history and putting the two together, a lot of that is fixing the drains and fixing the roof, because we're always in danger of forgetting how the whole thing works, to the point where if you say, oh, just love God and love your neighbor, hang on, which God are we talking about? And which neighbor are we talking about?
So several questions in this vein, and so however you would like to approach it, but is there a relationship between our Western obscured vision of Jesus and the current American political situation or broader world political situation? You don't have to get,
No.
I'm not asking you to
Sure.
get too political, but
No, I mean, absolutely, and I hope, it's a very serious thing, because I grew up in a world where all the talk about theology happened over there and all the talk about politics happened over there, and it took me years to join the two together. And the only reason I did so, which I was reluctant to do, was because I was studying Jesus in his historical context. And I just found that the two worlds did not belong apart, that they did belong together in the first century, which then makes you think, is that our fault, or were they getting it wrong, or what? And so I want to say, yes, a lot of our present puzzles are puzzles of narrative, puzzles of story, and I've instanced again and again in some of my recent work the problem when we had 5 years ago the so-called Arab Spring, when all the Western leaders in your country and mine assumed that the whole world was signed up to a narrative which says what you have to do if there's a dictator or tyrant is get rid of them, and then everyone will want to be nice, modern, liberal, Western, democratic peoples again. And we really believed that, and we acted on it, and we devoted billions of dollars and pounds to the pursuit of that goal. And we still think like that, even though the last 10 years, 15 years have shown us how catastrophically wrong that was. That's why we do not now have a narrative which will explain why there are refugees washing up on our shores, let alone a narrative that tells us what on earth to do about them, let alone all the other things. And something happened with the Enlightenment. You see, people say I'm anti-Enlightenment. I'm not. I do not want to be operated on by a postmodern dentist, or indeed a pre-modern one. I want high modernity, thank you very much, in my medical technology. But to think that because there were huge scientific and technological advances, therefore everything the 18th century said was right, is just folly. And you need to study the history of that, because the split of theology and the real world has had these enormous impacts on our whole way of doing society globally as well as nationally. I could say much more, but actually I wrote a little book not long ago called God in Public. It's actually a collection of essays. For some reason, my American publisher hasn't published it. It's published in Britain. You can get it on amazon.co.uk, but not on amazon.com. But so there's more stuff in there.
understood. The first century world of Jesus was much more oppressive than our context today in the Western world, such as Jesus only having male disciples. How do we make adjustments in Jesus' teaching for our day?
When Jesus was raised from the dead, it was the most important moment in history. And one of the most important things any human being was ever called to do in history was the first person to be told to go and tell other people that Jesus had been raised from the dead. That person was Mary Magdalene. I think I rest my case. Something happens at the resurrection which is life transforming. Until that moment, well, until the crucifixion and resurrection, there are all sorts of things which are kind of waiting to happen and which burst upon an unready world at that point. There is a real danger in imagining that ethics change with the calendar so that, well, they did then that stuff then, and we have to progress now. There's a real danger in assuming a sort of ethical progress as though we're all signed up to the fact that we get a little bit more, whether it's liberal in our values or conservative in our values or whatever, as time goes on. I think we all ought to know by now that life is much more interesting, actually, as well as much more complicated than that.
So in many Protestant churches, the Bible's been perceived as a prescriptive how to live life guide, suggestions on ways to help us think beyond the reductionistic Bible as a how-to manual framework.
Yeah, I'd much rather people use the Bible as a how-to manual than all sorts of other books I can mention or think of. You know, there's all sorts of distortions of Christianity, but at least if people say their prayers and go to church, then there's a chance that something's going to break through. We have cut the Bible down to size, again, to fit into our little ways of being. And one of my sort of purposes in life, so it seems, is to encourage people to read the Bible big. You know, plenty of people in our culture read Tolkien or read the Harry Potter novels or whatever. The Bible is no bigger than Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or the collection of Harry Potter novels. No reason why one shouldn't get to know the plot of the Bible, the characters in the Bible, how the narrative plot line works out. It's not, it'll tax you, but it's not rocket science. Anyone with a reasonable reading intelligence can do it. And if instead you try to satisfy yourself with 10 verses here and 5 verses there and a little maxim or a verse you learnt in Sunday school or whatever, yeah, again, that's better than nothing. Better than a lot of other rubbish you might have. But no, actually get the big story. It means what it means within the big story.
What are areas within the historical Jesus studies for aspiring scholars, students to explore, apart from the current early high Christology debates?
That's a good question. I mean, I've said a bit about the temple tonight. Biblical scholars, Old Testament scholars, Judaica scholars have written about the temple, have said the sort of things that I was saying tonight for many years, for 2 or 3 generations at least, and archaeology has helped and so on. Most New Testament scholars have hardly begun to clue into all of that, and I think there's a huge amount still waiting to be done there. There is so much more to learn about the world of first century Judaism. There's been great advances within the last 2 generations, particularly but not exclusively since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and new editions of all kinds of early Jewish texts. That's a wonderful, wonderful work, and there's far more to learn as a result. At any point, one can turn the corner and think, oh my goodness, maybe that was the nuance of that particular parable or whatever it is. So there is always going to be more. But I think particularly by understanding the centrality of the temple and what the temple actually meant as the microcosm, the promise of new creation. I think we're only just on the edge of beginning to figure all that out.
This questioner's been reading Barth's epistle to the Romans, and he speaks of the intersection of heaven and earth as well. But this questioner is struggling with my comprehension of this. Would you give just a little more insight into this idea?
The intersection of heaven and earth. Yeah, nice little question.
We'll do that now.
3 o'clock in the morning on my body clock.
We have till 9 p.m.
Of course, the big questions of theology all swirl around this. And what Karl Barth was doing in his commentary on the Romans, which was one of the great books of the early 20th century, was reacting against the easygoing liberalism of his teachers, who had all cheerfully gone along with the Kaiser in the First World War, etc. And Barth saw that actually you had to be able to hear a fresh word from God, especially when that word was no. You know, if you think you can read off divine purposes by just looking and seeing what is going on in history, then you are grievously mistaken and will run into great trouble. Barth already saw that in 1918 and went on saying it through the 1930s, which was why he had to leave Germany in a hurry and go back to his native Switzerland. But it seems to me that what he didn't get, certainly there, and I'm not sure even in the Church Dogmatics, not that I've read every volume of the Church Dogmatics, I've read a certain number of them, was this sense, again, of the eschatological narrative of Israel, of the story which was going towards a climax which was return from exile, new Exodus, and also of the centrality of that symbol. Because I think if you see that, then you see Jesus at the middle of a reconstructed cosmology, as it were. Sure. That you're learning cosmology from Jesus, though when you do that, you realize that it is in fact the thing that the Old Testament had been pointing to all along. I think Barth would have liked that, actually. I think he would have resonated with that. It's hard to channel the great master from Basel at this distance, but there we are.
Indeed. You mentioned the Jesus Seminar earlier in the lecture, and the Jesus Seminar claims that there's very little we can know of what Jesus actually said. Would you expand on what your take of this is and a little response to that?
If anyone wants more detail, I have written quite a lot about this about 20 years ago when it was at its height. In my book, Jesus and the Victory of God, there's a whole section on that and one or two ancillary articles. It was basically a high modernist project on the assumption that you could feed data into a kind of neutral, detached system which would spit out authentic historical answers. And of course, that's not how history works. It's not how the study of the past works. History works by telling stories, by hypothesis and verification, by looking at the big picture as well as the little pictures. And the original leaders of the Jesus Seminar, particularly Robert Funk, who's now dead but was the guru behind it all, he had very much a high modernist methodology as well as a high modernist desired conclusion. He knew what he wanted to find about Jesus, so he filtered the sayings to fit with that. And also it has to be said, and this is not a put down, because I had several good friends in the Jesus Seminar. Dom Crosson's a good friend. Walter Wink, the late Walter Wink, was in the Jesus Seminar. Marcus Borg, close friend of mine, again now late, sadly. So I knew these guys quite well. But most of the leading American Jesus scholars did not join in. Ed Sanders didn't join in. Jim Charlesworth didn't join in. J.P. Meyer didn't join in. The real big names of North American biblical scholarship, right across the board, Christian, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, etc., they didn't go along with it because they could see that it was actually rather a significantly flawed project, which I think has now run its course.
Let's one last question. I'm going to ask Priscilla Pope-Levison to join me on stage, and she's going to actually close the lecture if we'd all remain seated while she does that. And then at the right time, we want to certainly give you a big thank you. But this last question, how specifically does our culture warp the historical view of Jesus into a postmodern version of Christ? Just some specific examples in that regard.
Well, in movies and books where Jesus figures, then there are many, many distortions and so on. And I quoted Leonard Cohen's poem, and obviously some of the things he's saying, if you take it as though it's a literal theological statement or something, then it doesn't work. But you can see, I think, what he's doing with the poetic imagery, like you can with, say, T.S. Eliot in some of his work and so on. It seems to me the biggest distortion of all is this chronological, eschatological one. That the Western world, this is the world I grew up in, the world I just instinctively lapse back into if I don't catch myself. We really do believe that world history reached its climax when we, the modern West, were born out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. So everything that came before was kind of superstition, or they didn't quite get it, and we now know how things should be. That's been an amazing dream which we've been able to live on for 2.5 centuries, but we are now ourselves paying the price, and we are realizing that the rest of the world has had to pay the price all along. That's a very serious thing. And the reason I say it is this: if you think world history reached its climax in, say, the 1770s or whenever, then you cannot imagine that world history reached its climax when Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross and was raised again 3 days later. But the New Testament says that that is the truth rather than the modernist claim. And the problem with postmodernity is that it sees the arrogance of modernity, but it hasn't got anything to put in its place. So all postmodernity can do is to play. It plays with floating signifiers. It plays with Jesus images so that you can reconstruct. I'm going to the SBL conference in San Antonio next weekend, and there will be 1,000 different Jesus images literally playing around in seminars and lectures and so on. Fine, we maybe have to do that, but we're dancing on the edge of a volcano here. And the thing about postmodernity is basically preaching the doctrine of the fall, saying to arrogant modernity, all your righteousness is like filthy rags. But it's one thing to preach the fall. It's a good thing if you've got a gospel to preach afterwards, and postmodernity has no gospel, because ultimately you just look inside yourself and there's nothing there. But that doesn't mean you can run back to modernity. It means you have to go back and say, wait a minute, maybe world history really did reach its climax with Jesus himself.
So, Dr. Wright, many, many months ago, Priscilla Pope Levison had a dream and a vision that you would be on the stage at McFarland Auditorium, where indeed Martin Luther King actually even spoke, and that you would be able to share with the Perkins community, the SMU community, the Dallas community, what you've shared tonight and will the next few days. And so I know she wants to join me, and all of us want to join in thanking you, and she'll close our time. But let's thank Dr. Wright.
It's my privilege to close out the evening with a few words of appreciation and a few organizational details. First of all, appreciation to the sponsors listed in the program who, through their generosity, made possible these 3 free evenings and free parking, which, as you know, at SMU is no small feat. And especially a thank you to Highland Park Presbyterian Church, who enabled us to be in this incredible venue tonight. Secondly, Professor Wright's books will be for sale all 3 nights. He will not be doing a signing here. He's already signed a lot of books. It's time for him to get back to sleep so he can be fresh for the next 3 days. But you're welcome to take advantage of that. As most of you know, we will be in Highland Park United Methodist Church the next 2 nights. Kudos and thank you to that. As most of you know, we are in an overflow situation. We still want you to come. There will be a seat for you in Highland Park somewhere in the building, but after the 1,100 seats in Wesley Hall fill up, we have some dedicated rooms available with Highland Park staff there and live streaming available. Finally, an appreciation to all of you for coming tonight. We don't take that lightly. And I invite you to put on your calendar a year from now. We have 2 fabulous speakers coming, and I'm pleased to announce on November 13th and 14th, 2017, the author of a slew of best-selling books like Bird by Bird, Operating Instructions, and Traveling Mercies, Anne Lamott, will be here. And she will be joined by Reverend Dr. Marvin McMickle, who is president of Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, a well-known preacher and author of many books on preaching. So please save the date and come back and join us. And now I'd like to close us with this benediction. Now to the one who is able to keep us from falling and to make us stand without blemish in the presence of God's glory with rejoicing. To the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, power, and authority, before all time, now and forever. Amen. Good night.